G'day team, today we're painting up this 135 scale British SAS/LRDG trooper for the North Africa campaign. Now this figure is actually advertised as an LRDG trooper, but it'll work perfectly for either the long range desert group or the SAS. These two units worked very closely together in North Africa, particularly with the LRDG helping transport the SAS raiding parties deep behind enemy lines, and you'll see plenty of similarities in the clothing and equipment worn by both. I'm painting mine as an SAS trooper, but you can use the same technique if you're doing it as an LRDG trooper. We're going to cover everything from the face and sheepskin jacket through to his webbing, weapons, and some simple weathering techniques to bring the whole figure together. With that being said, let's jump into it. As usual with our figures, we're going to start with Vallejo black primer. Give the entire figure a nice even coat. We don't need to absolutely drown the poor bloke in primer here, just enough to completely cover the plastic and give all our future paint something solid to grab onto. Once that's dry, we'll come in with some white and give him some Zenithal highlights. Starting directly above the figure, spray the white downwards before gradually working your way around him and coming down to roughly a 45-degree angle from the top of his head. The idea here is to basically recreate how natural light would hit the figure. Doing this means we can allow some of that shading to show through our paint later on. We'll start the actual painting with probably the most noticeable part of the figure, his sheepskin jacket. For the leather outer section, I'm using Vallejo German Camo Medium Brown. These sorts of sheepskin and shearling lined garments were extremely useful in the desert because despite what you might imagine, in the desert, temperatures could drop dramatically at nighttime. Now we can move on to the face, hands, and exposed skin like his legs. I'm starting with Vallejo Flat Flesh, thinned down quite heavily with water. Rather than trying to get complete coverage immediately, we're going to build the skin color using glazes. Apply one thin layer, let it dry, then add another. I ended up doing around 5 of these layers before I was happy with the coverage. It does take a little longer, particularly on a 135 scale face, but this helps preserve all of those tiny details around the nose, mouth, eyes, and fingers. Once our flat flesh is dried, we can take brown rose and thin this down considerably more than before. We want something closer to a wash than an actual layer of paint. Carefully apply it over the face and you'll see the thinned paint naturally settle around the nose, underneath the cheekbones, and around the mouth and into the eye sockets. Do exactly the same thing across the hands and exposed parts of the legs. This adds some warmer tones into the skin while creating some very subtle shadows. And subtle is definitely the key word here. We're painting a sunbeaten British soldier, not someone who spent 3 weeks asleep on a Gold Coast beach. So again, keep this wash very subtle. Once that's dry, take basic skin tone or simply a lighter skin color than whatever you've used for your base, and thin it into another glaze. This time we're concentrating on the raised areas that would naturally catch the light. The bridge and tip of the nose, cheekbones, chin, forehead, and some of the raised areas on the hand. Now, when you're watching this back in 4K and we're basically zoomed directly into the poor bloke's pores, these highlights can look pretty stark. But remember how you're actually going to see the figure. You're not usually standing 10 centimeters away from his face with a macro lens. From a normal viewing distance, these exaggerated highlights help all of these tiny facial features remain visible. Now comes everyone's favorite part of figure painting. To paint in his eyes, I'm using medium brown rather than pure black. With the finest brush you've got, carefully paint in the eyes using an extremely thin line. Don't rush this. Then using that same fine-tipped brush, add a tiny dot for each eye, and I really do mean tiny. Start adding too much and things can get creepy really quickly. As you can see here, I've stuffed mine up. So if you do the exact same thing as I did, don't panic, let it dry, paint over the mistake with your skin color, and have another go. I ended up doing mine off camera because apparently the presence of a camera removes my ability to paint eyes. For his beard, use that same medium brown and very lightly pencil the color in. Follow where facial hair would naturally go around the jaw, chin, and upper lip rather than simply painting a solid brown section to his face. And there we go, we officially have a face. Now we can start blocking in the rest of his uniform. For this, we're going to use khaki. We'll use this across his khaki drill shorts, shirt, helmet cover, and the Arab style headscarf called a kufiya wrapped around his head. One of the interesting things about SAS and LRDG troops in North Africa is just how varied their clothing could become. These men operated deep behind enemy lines for extended periods, So photos often show combinations of standard British tropical uniforms, scarves, locally acquired clothing, and whatever else happened to be practical, which is great news for us as modelers because everything doesn't need to perfectly match. Again, keep your khaki slightly thinned and build it up gradually so some of our original Zenithal shading remains. For his ankle boots, I'm using German camo black brown. I much prefer this to the straight black for something like leather boots. Pure black can look very harsh at this scale, whereas black brown gives us that dark leather appearance while still having a warmer, dustier tone underneath. And considering this bloke has supposedly been wandering around the North African desert rather than polishing his boots for inspection, slightly worn leather is exactly what we're after. For his woolen socks, I've mixed US olive drab and khaki roughly at a 50-50 ratio. There's nothing particularly magical about that ratio. I mainly just want them to have a slightly different look from all the rest of the khaki clothing we've already painted up. On a figure this small, even subtle changes in color can help separate different pieces of clothing and equipment. For the laces, we'll grab our khaki again and lightly dry brush them. If you've never dry brushed before, it's incredibly simple. Get a small amount of paint on your brush, then wipe almost all of it away on a paper towel. Once you think you removed enough paint, remove a little bit more. Then lightly drag the brush across the raised details. Because there's barely any paint left on the bristles, it'll catch those raised surfaces without completely covering the dark color beneath. It's one of the easiest ways of picking out tiny details like these laces. Moving on to his sidearm holster and leather belt, we'll use flat earth. Again, we're deliberately changing up our browns here. We've already got enough German camo medium brown on the jacket and black brown on the boots. So using flat earth gives us another leather tone and stops the entire figure from becoming one giant brown blob. Carefully work your way around the edges here. There's quite a bit of equipment packed together, so take your time. If you accidentally hit something you've already painted, don't worry about it. We can come back later and tidy everything up. I've also just realized that I've completely forgot to paint one of his packs earlier. So if you have missed it like me, come back with some khaki and quickly paint it up. For the canteen, I'm using medium brown. Again, we're trying to vary these colors while keeping everything believable. If every leather, canvas, and wooden item gets painted the exact same brown, you'll lose a lot of detail in the finished figure. For the straps around the canteen, we'll use German camo beige World War II. The lighter canvas color gives us some contrast against the darker canteen underneath. It helps the whole thing really pop. Then for the majority of his remaining webbing and packs, I'm using US olive drab. Go slowly around all of these straps. This is probably one of the more tedious parts of the figure painting because you're working around equipment that we've already painted. If you make a mistake, let it dry and touch it up later. For the scarf around his neck, I'm using green gray. Again, this is mainly about separation. We could absolutely paint this in khaki as well, but sitting directly against his shirt, it would start to look like one continuous piece of clothing between his headscarf and his neck scarf. Now we can move on to his Tommy gun. We'll start with the wooden stock and grips using flat earth. This gives us a really simple base wood color. Before we finish the Thompson though, I'm going to jump back over to the jacket because apparently painting things in a logical order is not happening today. For the exposed wool lining of the jacket, we're using German camo beige World War II. But rather than painting this on completely opaque, thin it down a lot with water. We want just enough pigment that it's still behaving like paint, but we want some of that brown jacket underneath to remain visible. So don't thin it all the way down to a wash. As you work it across the textured wool, you'll notice bits of brown showing through and between and around the raised areas. That's exactly what we want. Real sheepskin being worn in these conditions isn't going to remain perfectly clean, bright, or white. Back to the Tommy gun. For all the metal sections, we're starting with plain black. Nothing exciting yet. Just carefully block in the receiver, barrel, magazine, and other metal components with the black. Once that's completely dry, we're going to use a simple trick to make it look actually like metal. Grab some white aluminium, and just like we did with the bootlaces before, remove almost all of the paint from your brush. Then very gently dry brush it across the edges and raised surfaces of the weapon. Suddenly that boring black looks like worn metal. It's a ridiculously simple trick, but at this scale, it works extremely well. We're nearly finished with the base painting for now. For the dark bands holding his headscarf in place, we'll use black. Use a fine brush and carefully follow the sculpted detail around the head. Then I'm going to go back to German camo black brown for all of the little buckles, buttons, clips, and darker fittings scattered across the figure. You could use metallic colors for some of these, but I prefer black brown. At this scale, it gives us enough contrast to make the tiny details pop without turning every buckle into a shiny silver dot. Work your way around the figure and also tidy up any mistakes that you can see. And once you're happy, we can finally start to weather him. Before we start weathering, I'm going to spray the entire figure with AK Interactive Intermediate Gauzy Agent. This does two things for us. Firstly, it protects all of the acrylic painting we've just spent far too long doing. More importantly though, it gives us a smooth surface for the enamel wash we're about to use. A smooth surface allows the enamel product to flow much more easily around the details rather than immediately staining and grouping the paint underneath. Give the figure an even coat and then leave that to dry properly before moving on. Now we're on to probably my favorite part of figure painting. This is where everything starts coming together. I'm using my usual enamel dark wash and applying it across the entire figure. And pretty much immediately, you'll see it running into all of the sculpted details. Around the straps, underneath equipment, between folds and the clothing, around the fingers, and into all those little recesses and nooks and crannies. It essentially creates artificial shadows for us. At the moment, it looks terrible and that's fine. We're gonna leave the wash for about 5 to 10 minutes. We want the enamel to start setting up, but we don't want it to completely dry. Then take a clean brush, dampen it with some enamel odorless thinner, and start removing the excess. As you work across the raised areas and flatter areas, the thinner cleans away the wash while leaving it behind in the recesses. Keep cleaning your brush as you go, rather than just removing dirty enamel around the figure. You can wipe it on a paper towel. You'll slowly see all of these original colors coming back, but now we've got a much stronger separation between every strap, pocket, fold, and piece of equipment. There's also another benefit here. We don't necessarily want this figure looking clean and perfect. These men were out operating for days at a time in some incredibly harsh conditions, so allowing a little staining to remain across the uniform gives everything a dusty, dirty, and field-worn appearance. The important thing to remember with this technique is that it's really about what you take off rather than what you put on. We've already covered the figure, now we're controlling the final effect by deciding how much of that wash we remove. There's no exact point where I can tell you that it's finished. Just keep working around the figure until you're happy with how your figure looks. Once you're happy with it, put the figure down, don't touch it. We need to let the enamels dry for at least 6 hours. For me, I usually leave it overnight just to be safe. Once everything is completely dry, we've got one final step. I'm using Ammo Mig Ultra Matte Lucky Varnish. Spray 1 or 2 thin coats across the entire figure. Apart from protecting everything we've just done, this also knocks down the shininess left behind by the gloss, varnish, and the enamel wash. And that makes a massive difference. And with that, our British Trooper is finished. And there we have it. One very dusty looking British SAS Trooper ready for North Africa. Hopefully this shows that you don't need to be some sort of miniature painting wizard to get a good looking 135 figure. Thin paints, take your time and let the sculpted details do the work for you. If you enjoyed this video or learnt something new, please consider leaving a comment, chuck it a like, and subscribe if you want to see more scale modeling tutorials. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Until next time, happy modeling, and I'll catch you in the next one.